If you read a lot of Agatha Christie, two things start to happen. The first is that you begin to respect how shamelessly she delays gratification. She will spend almost an entire book letting people pour tea, glance at each other across hallways, pause halfway down a staircase, say something odd at dinner, and then walk away as if nothing happened. And then, in the final pages, she suddenly opens the trapdoor, and the whole thing drops into place. She really knew how to make a reader wait. The second thing is stranger. Her books are always full of people, and among them there are often one or two figures who make you stop and think, wait, why is this person living here? They are not the owner of the house. They are not exactly a servant. They are not just visiting for a weekend. And yet they are simply there, moving through the manor, eating meals, hearing arguments, absorbing secrets, as if they have every right to remain under that roof. I remember having this feeling again and again while reading Christie. Why are there always these semi-attached people in the house? People with vague social status, unclear income, no obvious home of their own, and yet somehow completely embedded in the daily life of a grand estate. And once I started noticing it, I realized this was not just an Agatha Christie thing. It shows up all over 19th century and early 20th century British fiction. Then if you look even further back, you find similar figures in other civilizations too. The retainers of the Warring States period in China, the dependents of ancient Rome. Different settings, different costumes, same basic social logic. Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. In this video, I want to talk about those people in fiction who seem to be living in somebody else's house. Who were they? Why could they stay there? Why did this once feel normal? And why does it now feel almost absurd? The deeper you go into that question, the more you realize that these characters are not just background decoration in old novels. They are traces of an older world, a world in which survival often depended less on finding a job and more on finding someone powerful enough to shelter you. 5 kinds of guests. The first thing to say is that these people were not all the same. The dependent resident in an old country house could take several different forms, and once you separate them out, a lot of these novels suddenly make more sense. One familiar type was the poor relation. Jane Austen gives us a perfect example in Mansfield Park, published in 1814. Its heroine, Fanny Price, comes from a poor family and is sent to live with her wealthy relatives at Mansfield Park. She is not a servant, but she is very clearly not the daughter of the house either. She eats at the same table, grows up alongside her cousins, and yet her position is full of tension. She is included, but never quite equal. She is sheltered, but never allowed to forget that the shelter came from someone else's generosity. That is part of what makes Austen so sharp. She understands that being taken in is not the same as belonging. In a society where family was still one of the main structures for distributing education, security, marriage prospects, and basic respectability, a poor relative could be absorbed into a richer branch of the family. But the arrangement came with invisible terms. Gratitude was expected. Humility was expected. A constant awareness of one's place was expected. The room and the dinner and the future were being provided, but the emotional price was very real. Another type was the live-in worker, though even that phrase feels too modern and too clean for what these roles actually were. The most famous example is Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte's 1847 novel gives us a heroine who arrives at Thornfield Hall as a governess. Jane is there because she works, she teaches the child, she earns her living. But she is not simply a servant either. She is educated, she is respectable, and she occupies that very awkward social middle ground, which Victorian fiction knew how to exploit with brutal precision. This is one of the reasons Jane Eyre still feels so alive. Jane lives in the house, but she does not belong to the house. She moves through the same architecture, yet not on the same terms. In a great estate, even space itself becomes social language. Which rooms you enter, who you dine with, where you sit, how you are introduced, all of that tells you what you are worth. The governess pays for her place not just with labor, but with a kind of suspended selfhood. She is present and useful and necessary, yet never fully at ease. Then there is the long-term guest, which may be the hardest one for modern readers to instinctively understand. Today, spending a few nights in someone else's home already suggests intimacy. Spending an entire season there would feel almost surreal, but in upper-class British life, especially in the world of country houses and summer visits, this was entirely legible. Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, published in 1927, gives us a beautiful version of this arrangement. Lily Briscoe is a painter. William Bankus is a close family friend. They are not owners of the Ramsays' summer house, and yet they are part of its life. They are folded into the rhythms of meals, walks, conversations, moods, and silences. This is one of the things I personally love about To the Lighthouse. It understands that people can dwell in a household emotionally long before they have any legal claim to it. Lily is not there to save money. She is there because the social world Woolf is writing about allows for this extended form of presence. The guest is not simply a visitor. The guest becomes part of the atmosphere. And because Woolf herself drew on childhood memories of family summers by the sea, these arrangements feel lived in rather than invented. A fourth type was the household dependent who had real internal authority. This figure is not exactly family, not exactly servant, but someone who knows the house better than almost anyone else. Mrs. Danvers in Rebecca is the perfect example. Daphne du Maurier's 1938 novel turns her into a guardian of memory, ritual, and emotional pressure. She is attached to Manderley, and in some ways she understands its true order more deeply than the new mistress ever can. Christie also loves this kind of figure. The companion, the secretary, the long-standing female aide, the person who appears secondary but quietly knows where everything is buried. These people are fascinating because they are dependent and powerful at the same time. They do not own the house, but they sustain its routines. They know who hates whom, who is pretending, who is ashamed, who is still grieving, who cannot afford a scandal. In a mystery, that kind of person is gold. And then there is the fifth type, the one that comes closest to what people today might casually call a freeloader. Dickens is wonderful at writing this figure. In Bleak House, the character Harold Skimpole survives by performing helplessness. He presents himself as innocent, artistic, childlike, untouched by practical concerns, and all the while he lives off the patience and kindness of other people. Dickens is not just giving us an annoying man. He is showing us what happens in a world where private benevolence still fills the gaps that public institutions have not yet filled. If a society runs on personal protection, personal influence, and personal generosity, then some people will become experts at living inside that softness. So these 5 figures may all look, at first glance, like people simply residing in someone else's home. But they are not interchangeable. Some are poor relatives, some are live-in workers, some are social guests, some are internal managers of domestic order. Some are people kept afloat by a combination of charm, habit, and tolerated uselessness. Once you see those distinctions, old fiction stops looking random and starts looking precise. What they paid. Now we can ask the real question. What were these people actually living on? Why were they allowed to stay? The answer is not generosity in the abstract. The answer is exchange. The poor relation repaid shelter with obedience, gratitude, emotional caution, and often usefulness within the family circle. The governess or companion repaid lodging with labor, but not just labor in the narrow sense. She offered education, supervision, tact, social polish, emotional steadiness, and a form of constant availability. The long-term guest repaid hospitality with company, conversation, information, networks, and the subtle prestige of making a house feel lively and connected. The household dependent with internal authority repaid her place by keeping the entire machine running. And even the so-called freeloader sometimes played a strange social role, because to support someone visibly dependent on you could enhance your image as a generous, broad-minded, well-positioned person. This is the point where the great house starts to look less like a private home and more like a small institution. It is a residence, yes, but also a social theater, a network hub, a workplace, a marriage market, a memory archive, and sometimes a trap. A person living there is not just occupying a spare bedroom. They are entering a structure of unequal reciprocity. And once you start seeing the manor this way, Agatha Christie suddenly becomes even more interesting. Her houses are perfect engines for mystery because they are full of people who all know part of the truth and all depend on each other in different ways. The poor relative knows where the humiliations lie. The governess notices what the family does not say aloud. The companion hears confidences. The dependent guest senses tensions around inheritance and debt. The household aide sees how the performance of respectability is maintained from day to day. Everyone is watching. No one sees everything. That is exactly the kind of environment in which murder becomes narratively irresistible. From retainers to dependents. At this point, we are already moving beyond English fiction, because the deeper pattern here is much older and much wider. Take the retainers of the Warring States period in ancient China. This was an age of intense political competition, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 3rd century BCE, when rival states fought for dominance and ruling elites gathered talent around themselves with extraordinary urgency. The famous four lords of the Warring States, figures like Lord Mengcheng and Lord Xinling, were known for maintaining large circles of retainers. These men were not simply feeding idle guests for the sake of vanity. Their retainers could advise, negotiate, gather intelligence, perform dangerous missions, enhance prestige, and extend political reach. To have many men under your protection was itself a sign of influence. I think this comparison is incredibly revealing. The British country house resident and the Chinese retainer do not look the same on the surface. One belongs to drawing rooms and summer visits. The other belongs to a more openly political and martial environment, but both are embedded in systems where access to resources flows through persons before it flows through institutions. You survive by entering a network. You rise by attaching yourself to someone whose power can make room for you. Ancient Rome had its own version of this as well, in the relationship between patron and dependent. A patron offered legal support, economic help, public backing, and social protection. In return, the dependent offered loyalty, attendance, endorsement, and service. The relationship was unequal, but it was also structured. It was one of the ways Roman society organized obligation and power. What matters here is not the exact terminology, but the underlying logic. Your life chances were tied to who would claim you, recommend you, receive you, or shield you. This is why I find these old fictional households so compelling. They preserve a world in which identity is not fully formed before relationship. Very often, relationship comes first. You are taken in, attached, sponsored, protected, placed. Then, from within that arrangement, you begin to build a position. Modern people like to imagine that they first become independent selves and then freely enter relationships. Older societies were often the reverse. You entered the web first. Then whatever selfhood you could carve out had to emerge from inside it. Why fiction loves them. This is also why literature loves these figures so much. They are ideal for revealing the truths a society cannot easily say out loud. Austen uses the poor relation to expose the tension between kindness and hierarchy. Brontë uses the governess to expose the unstable dignity of educated women without wealth. Woolf uses the long-term guest and the perceptive outsider to reveal the emotional weather of a family. Du Maurier uses the household dependent to show how memory can become power. Christie uses the entire structure as a machine for secrecy, resentment, performance, and revelation. What I admire in all of them is that these characters are never just decorative. They are pressure points. They reveal where a household is weak, where it is cruel, where it is pretending, where it is running on guilt, where it is unable to modernize, where it is still ruled by old loyalties. They are the people who do not fully belong, and because they do not fully belong, They often see more clearly than the people who imagine themselves at home. That may be the reason these novels still feel so rich. On the surface, they give us estates, dinners, inherited money, whispered conversations, and occasionally murder. Beneath that, they give us a study of how people live under unequal shelter. And that is a much larger and more enduring subject: the rent they paid. So if I had to compress this whole video into one thought, it would be this. The people living under someone else's roof were not always there because they were doing nothing. Very often, they were paying a different kind of rent. Not rent in money, but rent in loyalty, usefulness, deference, intellect, company, emotional labor, management, and self-restraint. The poor relation paid in humility. The governess paid in skill and discipline. The long-term guest paid in social circulation. The household dependent paid in order and continuity. The charming parasite paid, in a strange way, by allowing the patron to act out generosity itself. And once you see that, these old novels stop feeling quaint. They start to feel diagnostic. They show you how a society distributes shelter, dignity, and opportunity when institutions are still weak or uneven, and when private protection remains one of the main ways people move through the world. That world has changed, of course. Schools, companies, labor contracts, rental markets, professional credentials, and welfare systems have taken over some of the functions once handled by households and patrons. On the surface, it looks as if dependent residence has vanished. But I do not think it has vanished entirely. I think it has become less visible. The manor is gone, but the logic lingers. Recommendation, patronage, informal sponsorship, being brought into a circle by someone already inside, these are still with us. The old arrangement has not disappeared so much as changed costume. And maybe that is why these books continue to resonate. They are not only about country houses and inherited silver and suspicious tea trays. They are about how human beings try to build a life inside structures they do not control. They are about what it means to live under a roof that is sheltering you and judging you at the same time. That is all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe. See you at the next Lighthouse.